Number 13. A double dose of revenge porn. Most revenge porn crimes are committed electronically, but one Louisiana woman allegedly decided to go the old-fashioned route in 2020 by mailing intimate photos of two individuals to over 24 people. According to the Calcasieu Parish Sheriff's Office, 32-year-old Sarah D. Faris of Sulphur had access to one of the victim's personal information. She was accused of sending degrading letters about the man to at least 30 people, along with copies of his nude photos, and traveling to Texas to mail the letters. Sheriff's Deputy Stitch Gullery told local station Fox 29 that the victim was contacted by multiple people about the letters. The man realized that Faris had access to his social media account because she had helped him set it up years earlier. After learning about Faris's alleged revenge plot, authorities charged her with 150 counts of non-consensual disclosure of a private image. She was released on a $75,000 bond later that day, but soon ended up back in custody on even more charges. Just weeks after her first arrest, Faris was accused of including photos of not one, but two victims in the perverted pamphlets that she sent in the mail. She was charged with another 30 counts of non-consensual disclosure of a private image. Faris was freed on a $15,000 bond and scheduled to return to court at a later date. The outcome of the case is unclear. Number 12. Hilda Nordhoek. 27-year-old Robert Miller arrived at his Wichita, Kansas home one day in 2018 to find a screen door ripped off its hinges, a smashed mailbox, and a window that had been shattered by a brick. Inside, he found his beloved dog beaten to death. Police initially failed to identify a suspect, but continued to investigate the case. In the meantime, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, better known as PETA, offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to the identification and arrest of the person responsible. Miller was devastated by the loss of his 10-year-old American bulldog, who he called Buffalo Boy. Nearly a year later, in early 2019, police charged 30-year-old Hilda Nordhoek in connection with the crime after identifying her through surveillance footage and a license plate reader program. Prosecutors claimed that the woman had a romantic past with Miller and accused her of killing his dog in a jealous rage. In 2021, Nordhoek pleaded no contest to animal cruelty, theft, and burglary, and was sentenced to 30 days in jail plus 2 years of probation. While handing down the sentence, the judge issued a stern warning that if she violated the terms of her probation, she would automatically be required to serve 13 months in prison for burglary, plus 12 months in county lockup for animal cruelty. Number 11. Candice Nicole Jones and Edward Brannon Barry. 10 days after 34-year-old mother of two Emily Hacker vanished in early 2017, her body was found in a shallow grave in rural Burleson County, Texas. The contents of the burial were burned in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence, but the medical examiner was able to conclude that the young woman died from blunt force injuries. Investigators quickly discovered that Hacker had been recently pulled over by the police for a routine traffic stop. While searching her vehicle, officers found a gun. Hacker told the cops that the weapon wasn't hers and that it belonged to 32-year-old Candice Nicole Jones of Rockdale. Detectives theorized that Jones murdered Hacker for ratting her out to the police. She and 4 other suspects, including 32-year-old Edward Brannon Barry, were arrested in connection with Hacker's death. Jones and Barry were each charged with 1 count of capital murder. Jones and Brannon both pleaded guilty and were sentenced to 50 years in prison. As part of their plea agreements, they waived their right to appeal their cases. According to records, they will both become eligible for parole in 2042, and their latest release date is in 2067. Number 10. Yasmin Walker. A very unfortunate British man was enjoying a movie at the cinema one day in 2021 when he began receiving text messages informing him that his nude photo had been posted on social media. His ex-girlfriend, 30-year-old Yasmin Walker, had shared the intimate snapshot with her 1,300 followers, along with a sarcastic comment asking, "What the bleep is that?" followed by a laughing emoji. The victim begged Walker to delete the post. She finally complied when the man threatened to call the police, but by then, the damage was done. Authorities charged Walker with disclosing a private photo with the intent to cause distress. Walker claimed that she posted the photo by accident and blamed her poor vision for clicking the wrong button. During her trial, her attorney argued that his client suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from multiple abusive relationships, although none of those relationships were with the victim in the revenge porn case. In fact, Walker claimed that her vision was bad because of injuries that an ex-boyfriend caused during an attack. The defendant's lawyer also told the court that Walker suffered from a nearly decade-long marijuana habit and that she was trying to kick the habit for good. While the judge took these factors into consideration, he also thought that it was important to sentence Walker appropriately for her actions and to set an example by imposing a punishment that showed that this type of crime will not be tolerated. Walker received a 3-month reduced prison sentence in what the judge described as a short, sharp shock, so that people know revenge pornography means prison. Number 9. Kenisha, Rice, and Sheldon Johnson. 39-year-old Kenyana Edwards made the fateful decision to drive drunk after leaving a nightclub in early 2023. She drove the wrong way along a Las Vegas highway and collided with another car at 2:30 in the morning. Edwards and the other driver both died at the scene. A toxicology test later revealed that Edwards' blood alcohol level was more than 3 times the legal limit when she got behind the wheel, and she also had cocaine and marijuana in her system. Tragedy struck again the very next day when Edwards' boyfriend, 35-year-old Martin Loftus, was found dead in his apartment with multiple gunshot wounds. Evidence at the scene suggested that the shooter had followed Loftus down a hallway as he tried to run into a bedroom to hide. Based on witnesses' description of a vehicle that was seen leaving the apartment complex, along with other pieces of evidence, investigators identified the suspected killers as Kenyana Edwards' brother, 34-year-old Sheldon Johnson, and his girlfriend, 36-year-old Kenisha Rice. According to police, Johnson had made posts on social media implying that he blamed Loftus for his sister's death. He also allegedly alluded to his plans to murder Loftus as revenge for Edwards' death. Johnson and Rice were arrested in California and extradited to Las Vegas, where they each face charges of open murder, conspiracy to commit murder, burglary, and conspiracy to commit burglary. Number 8. David Crawford. Investigators in 6 counties across Maryland spent 2 decades trying to solve a string of nearly a dozen arsons that started during the early 2000s and resulted in multiple families losing their homes and/or vehicles. Several of the fires were set when the victims were asleep in the middle of the night. Miraculously, all of the families who were targeted in the years-long crime spree managed to escape the flames without physical injury. Law enforcement wasn't even sure if all the crimes were connected until 2020, when they discovered evidence in the aftermath of yet another arson that finally led them to a suspect. The victims had a history of disagreements with former Laurel Police Chief David Crawford, who had retired back in 2010. A closer look into previous cases revealed even more connections between Crawford and past victims, who all had a history of issues with the former top cop. The targets included former colleagues, a chiropractor, and even Crawford's stepson. Evidence at the crime scenes showed a repeated pattern of the culprit using gasoline as an accelerant, and at least one of the crimes was captured on home surveillance footage. During a search of Crawford's home in 2021, investigators found evidence further connecting him to the crimes, including a list of targets. And while they were able to connect Crawford to the crime using forensic evidence, his grudges against the victims proved to be the big break in the case that led to the rest of the discoveries pointing toward his possible guilt. The accused serial arsonist was finally arrested in March of 2021. He was charged with 58 counts in 4 different counties, including Prince George's County, Montgomery County, Frederick County, and Howard County. Following a months-long trial in early 2023, a Howard County judge convicted Crawford of 8 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 3 counts of arson, and 1 count of malicious burning in connection with 3 separate arsons. He received 8 life sentences, 6 of which are to be served concurrently, plus 75 years behind bars. As long as the conviction and sentence stand, the 71-year-old will never be released from prison. Crawford has maintained his innocence throughout the case and continues to do so as he awaits trial in various other counties. He plans to appeal his conviction despite facing at least 4 more attempted murder charges and at least 3 counts of first-degree arson. Number 7. Michael Keetley. A group of 6 men were playing cards and drinking beer outside a home in Ruskin, Florida on Thanksgiving Day in 2010 when a minivan pulled up to the property. Armed with a shotgun and wearing a shirt that said Sheriff on it, the driver exited the vehicle and told the men he was looking for someone who went by the nickname Creeper. The group knew Creeper, but he wasn't at the gathering. Suddenly, the armed visitor ordered everyone to the ground. Believing that he was a real cop, the friends followed the man's orders. But he wasn't a police officer, and he proceeded to shoot the men one by one, killing 28-year-old Juan Gutron and his 22-year-old brother Sergio Gutron. The other 4 victims survived their injuries. Police were initially at a loss to identify the suspect, who fled the scene before law enforcement arrived. A few days after the shooting, an informant told investigators that a local ice cream man, Michael Keetley, had recently been talking about his plans to get revenge on a pair of thieves who had robbed and opened fire on him 11 months earlier. The masked gunman shot Keetley 5 times, leaving him permanently disabled, and made off with $12 that they stole from his truck. Keetley had mistakenly suspected Creeper of being one of the thieves, when in reality none of his 6 victims had anything to do with the robbery. As it turned out, they were targeted in a disturbing case of mistaken identity. Authorities arrested Keetley several days after the crime, and he spent the next decade languishing in jail until the case went to trial in 2020. His defense attorneys argued that he was medically incapable of committing the crime due to his injuries from being shot months earlier. They also accused the police of carrying out a faulty investigation, which they described as nothing short of a nightmare. The first trial ended in a mistrial, and the case dragged on for 3 more years. In 2023, more than 12 years after the shooting, a second jury found Keetley guilty of 2 counts of murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 6 concurrent life terms without the chance of parole, and he reportedly plans to appeal his case. Number 6. Seoul subway slaying. While working for the Seoul metro system in South Korea's capital in 2019, Jeonju Huan expressed an interest in a 28-year-old female co-worker. The woman rejected his advances, but he refused to take no for an answer. Instead of respectfully backing off, Jeon persisted in his attempts to woo his colleague, calling her more than 300 times and begging her to date him. When she continued to turn him down, the crazed admirer threatened to hurt himself. Over time, John's behavior escalated from annoying to terrifying as his stalking campaign became increasingly aggressive. He even installed a hidden camera in a workplace bathroom and threatened to blackmail his co-worker with the videos he captured. After dealing with the unwanted advances for 2 years, the victim reported John to the police in 2021. She filed a second complaint a few months later. Authorities charged John with stalking, illegal filming, and threatening, and he was fired from his job. Prosecutors attempted to detain John pending the outcome of his case, but they failed to obtain the court's approval to hold him in custody due to his low risk of fleeing. No order of protection was issued for the victim, who was essentially left to deal with the situation on her own as Jeon continued to terrorize her. After being convicted in connection with the woman's first complaint and sentenced to 9 years in prison, Jeon appealed his case. He remained free even as he continued to harass and intimidate the victim, including with demands to settle his criminal case in a way that was favorable to him. On the day before Jeon was scheduled to be resentenced, he hid inside the employee bathroom wearing a swim cap and rubber gloves and waited for his co-worker to enter. He brutally stabbed the woman to death at the end of her shift, sparking widespread public outrage over the missed opportunities to prevent the tragedy from happening in the first place. Jeon admitted that he killed his victim as an act of revenge for getting him in trouble with the law. When the woman refused to settle his criminal case, he became intent on murdering her. The obsessed killer was convicted of murder. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, but the court sentenced Jeon to 40 years in prison, followed by 15 years on an ankle monitor. The woman's murder happened right around the same time South Korea implemented a new anti-stalking law, and yet the policy failed to protect her. In response to nationwide protests, the country's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, ordered the Justice Ministry to improve the legislation. Lawmakers removed a clause that previously banned authorities from prosecuting suspects without a victim's consent, which arguably put victims at risk of retaliation from the accused. Stalking suspects are also now required to wear an ankle monitor even before sentencing. These long overdue changes came amid a years-long battle to improve legal protections for victims of gender-based violence in South Korea. And while many activists continue to campaign for additional improvements, the heightened policies mark a major step in the right direction toward keeping victims safe and holding perpetrators accountable. Number 5. Jake Balata. When 22-year-old Jake Balata's PlayStation disappeared in 2018, he suspected his former roommate, 24-year-old Joshua Barnes, of stealing the console. Barnes had recently been evicted from their apartment in Maitland, Florida for not paying his rent, and Balata believed that his ex-roomie had broken back into the unit and stolen the video game system, along with a bong and a marijuana scale. A third roommate, Ian McClurg, would later tell investigators that Balata was beyond pissed about the alleged theft and that he had punched a hole in the wall during a fit of rage. Balata's anger only grew when he heard that Barnes was supposedly bragging to people about stealing the PlayStation. In addition to being outraged, Balata was worried that the talk would inspire others to burglarize his apartment. Intent on getting his PlayStation back, Balata devised a plan to lure Barnes to the residence. He invited his former roommate to a made-up event, promising that there would be women there. When Barnes arrived at the apartment, Balata stabbed him to death in a frenzied knife attack while McClurg watched. Balata and McClurg planned to wrap Barnes' body in garbage bags and remove it from the apartment. But their new roommate unexpectedly arrived home and dialed 911 after discovering the carnage inside. During the call, the roommate told the emergency dispatcher that there was a history of problems between the suspects and the victim, but that he didn't know exactly what had happened because he had just walked in the door. When the dispatcher asked the young man how he knew Barnes was dead, he said that the victim was laying on top of a plastic bag and not moving. He also said that he was afraid that the suspects would do something to harm him and his girlfriend since they were aware of the crime. Thankfully, officers apprehended Balata and McClurg before anyone else could get hurt. Balata claimed that he killed Barnes in self-defense, but his story didn't hold up in court. He was convicted of murder and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. McClurg pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and tampering with evidence and received a 10-year prison sentence. Number 4. Gruesome Gangland Execution. Residents in New York City's East Harlem neighborhood were sent running for cover one evening in April of 2023 when a young man was shot in the head at the intersection of East 123rd Street and Lexington Avenue. A local hairdresser named Sochna later told the New York Daily News that she heard around 4 shots. The moment the gunfire broke out, she and other terrified civilians took shelter in the back of her hair salon, where they prayed that no stray bullets would pierce the storefront's glass entrance and strike them in their path. Paramedics rushed the victim, 26-year-old Hector Delgado, to the hospital, but it was too late to save him. Members of the community were left shaken and exasperated by the violence, which some said happens too often. Police arrested the accused shooter, 23-year-old Trevor Gibbs, 3 weeks later. According to prosecutors, Gibbs murdered Delgado as revenge for the point-blank execution 3 days earlier of 19-year-old Jalen Duncan. The slayings came amid an ongoing feud between gangs, and investigators believe that Delgado's murder was also linked to the drug trade. Gibbs faces 1 murder count along with a weapons charge. 5 more suspects were charged in connection with the crime, including 24-year-old Andre Clark, who faces a murder charge. 20-year-old James Figueroa, 21-year-old Ethaniel Coleman, and 25-year-old Ibrahim Ndaya were each charged with 1 count of attempted murder. All 5 of the men and a 6th suspect, 21-year-old Kevin Major, were hit with conspiracy charges. They're being held without bail at Rikers Island while they await the next steps in their cases. Number 3. Robert Manor and Victor Gray. In January 2018, 55-year-old Raymond Wright vanished without a trace from his workplace in Rockland, California. He was never seen again. 2 days after Wright's disappearance, his brother encountered a strange man inside Wright's home. The man fled the scene, leaving behind a drinking cup. About a week after that, Wright's abandoned truck was found, but the missing man himself was nowhere to be found. 5 days later, a man named Victor Gray led police on a chase while intoxicated behind the wheel. When law enforcement caught up with him, they found evidence in his vehicle that they later connected to Wright's case, including a bloody raincoat, Wright's wallet, and several other belongings of his. Meanwhile, a DNA hit from the drinking cup that was left behind at Wright's house turned up as a match to Gray. Investigators also discovered a letter from Gray to a man named Robert Manor, complaining about not receiving a payment for what sounded like a hired hit on Wright. 7 years earlier, Wright had crashed his vehicle drunk, causing serious injuries to Robert Manor and his wife. Wright served prison time for the accident, but his mysterious disappearance and the evidence connecting Manor to the case led detectives to believe that Manor never let go of his grudge against Wright for the crash. In a rare case of authorities pursuing a murder case without a body, prosecutors accused Manor of hiring Gray to murder Wright as revenge for the previous DUI crash. A jury convicted both men of first-degree murder, and they were each sentenced to life in prison without parole. Wright's body remains missing to this day. It's understandable that Manor was upset with Wright for the life-changing consequences of his decision to get behind the wheel drunk, but two wrongs don't make a right, and Manor's refusal to move on from the incident in a healthy and legal way only hurt him more in the end by taking away his freedom. Number 2. Marquis Goodwin. During the pre-dawn hours one morning in July of 2023, 18-year-old Lovell Brown left his home in Sanford, Florida on foot with his mother and several other family members to go buy some snacks. Along their walk to a nearby Circle K convenience store, the family crossed paths with a group of 3 to 4 people who were heading in the opposite direction. According to Brown's mother, Paulette Ramsey, a man from the group approached her son and an altercation broke out between the young men. The fight quickly escalated to blows and then gunshots. In what can only be described as a mother's worst nightmare, Ramsey stood by helplessly as her son collapsed to the ground. A bystander performed CPR in a desperate attempt to revive the young man, but he died from his injuries. Authorities charged the alleged shooter, 18-year-old Marquis Goodwin, with Lovell's murder. Ramsey recognized the suspect as someone her son had gone to high school with. She told investigators that in the months leading up to Lovell's death, she had received phone calls from several of her incarcerated friends, warning her to move her son out of the area for his own safety. The concerned mother initially heeded the warnings and sent Lovell to stay with his sister in California. He moved back to Florida a few months later and tried to keep a low profile, but the threats continued. On the day before Lovell's murder, someone allegedly threw a heavy rock at Ramsey's residence. Just hours before the shooting, Lovell had received a text message from someone who disliked him, challenging him to go outside. He ignored the harassment and stayed at home until the snack run later that night. According to court documents, Goodwin's cousin told police that she tried to persuade him not to go out that evening, because she suspected that he was in a gang and that something bad might happen. Others reported that Goodwin and Brown were entangled in a long-running feud and that Lovell had beaten up his killer in the past. Goodwin had recently served jail time in an unrelated case, and the rivalry continued even after the two men were given some much-needed space from one another. Authorities believe that Goodwin killed Lovell in an act of revenge over their previous run-ins. The suspect is being held without bail as he awaits trial. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. Josue Vasquez. 18-year-old Alyssa Banks was a member of the National Honor Society and the senior class president at her high school in Largo, Maryland. She was looking forward to the next chapter in her life after graduating in 2016. While out on a date with her boyfriend, Deshaun Moore, during the early morning hours a few months later, Alyssa got out of the car to help her beau parallel park. It was just before 2 o'clock in the morning when a group of men approached the couple. A man later identified by law enforcement as 20-year-old Josue Vasquez allegedly opened the door of the car that Alyssa's boyfriend was driving and asked him where he was from. According to authorities, as soon as Moore mentioned that he was from Largo, one of the men opened fire on the couple. Moore survived, but Alyssa died from a gunshot wound to the head. The case went unsolved for 2 years. Finally, in 2018, Vasquez and 2 alleged accomplices, Thomas Jenkins and Daniel Butler, were charged with Alyssa's murder. Prosecutors accused Vasquez of shooting Alyssa to avenge the death of a friend who had been killed at a house party a year earlier, even though neither Alyssa nor her boyfriend were at the house party or involved in the previous killing. Moore reportedly identified Vasquez as the gunman, and a friend of the defendant also claimed that they had overheard him confessing to the crime. Vasquez's co-defendant, Thomas Jenkins, testified in court that on the night of the shooting, he and Vasquez were looking around for anyone who matched the description of someone who had been at the house party a year earlier. Jenkins admitted that he didn't recognize the victims and claimed that the gun he was carrying malfunctioned and didn't fire. Jenkins took a plea deal while the case against Vasquez went to trial. Vasquez's lawyers argued that 2 of the key witnesses in the case were unreliable. They also claimed that the witnesses' testimony was bought and paid for in exchange for leniency in their own criminal cases. Moreover, there were some alarming discrepancies between Moore's description of the shooter as a black man who was at least 6 feet tall, and Vasquez, a Hispanic man who stands at just 5 feet 7 inches tall. After considering the evidence, the jury acquitted Vasquez, marking an emotional victory for the defense and a heartbreaking disappointment for the victims' families. Number 15. John Dillinger. One of America's most notorious gangsters of all time, John Dillinger, led a gang that committed at least a dozen bank robberies in 4 states during the Great Depression. While many Americans grew to see him as a heroic Robin Hood-like figure, law enforcement considered him a major public enemy. Dillinger already had plenty of priors when he kicked off the year-long robbery spree with a $10,000 heist in June of 1933. By the following April, he knew that he was bound for one of 2 fates: prison or death. Authorities were determined to capture him. In fact, he was one of the main platforms for future FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's campaign to establish the federal law enforcement agency. While he seemed resigned to the fate of ending up either dead or behind bars, he also wanted to prolong his life on the lam for as long as possible. In the past, Dillinger had dyed his hair and used fake mustaches and other forms of disguises, but his picture was so widely distributed that he didn't think it would be enough to conceal his identity. So he paid $5,000 for plastic surgery to remove moles, adjust the angle of his mouth, tighten his cheeks, remove his dimples, and alter some of his other widely recognizable features. He also had his fingerprints burned off with hydrochloric acid. Another member of Dillinger's gang, Homer Van Meter, also received plastic surgery. The work was performed illegally by a former doctor named Wilhelm Losa, who famously provided plastic surgery to criminals during the 1930s. As an underworld figure himself, Losa had a history of dealing narcotics and had done prison time. There was nothing legitimate about the plastic surgery he performed, which took place in someone's apartment. Dillinger nearly died during one of his procedures when he choked on his tongue under general anesthesia. Not surprisingly, both men were extremely angry with the results of their surgeries, so much so that Van Meter threatened to kill Losa on the spot after seeing how the procedures turned out. Less than 2 weeks later, a brothel madam tipped the FBI off to Dillinger's location at the Biograph Theater in Chicago, where he was watching a gangster movie. Upon leaving the theater, Dillinger realized the property had been staked out by federal agents and attempted to flee on foot, but he was shot multiple times and died, bringing his criminal career to an end. Dillinger's body was put on public display before his burial, attracting more than 15,000 viewers. In 2019, surviving relatives sued for permission to exhume his body for a History Channel documentary amid rumors that the body might not actually belong to Dillinger. The court initially granted the request, but ultimately sided with the cemetery, which didn't want the exhumation to take place. The family then halted their efforts to have Dillinger's remains exhumed, and the History Channel show was called off. Number 14. Vladimiro Montesinos. For years, former Peruvian head of intelligence Vladimiro Montesinos received ample support despite indications of possible corruption. That all changed though in 2000, when videos of Montesinos bribing congressmen to support then-President Alberto Fujimori were leaked to the public. A scandal erupted and Montesinos fled the country with his tail between his legs. In the meantime, Fujimori was declared morally unfit for the presidency and left office. An investigation yielded evidence pointing toward Montesinos being involved in a plethora of crimes, including embezzlement, gun running, human rights abuses, and drug trafficking. While on the run, he sought asylum in Panama and was denied. He briefly returned to Peru, then traveled by yacht to the Galapagos Islands and Costa Rica. The boat's captain, Fidencio Anton Paiva, told authorities that Montesinos seemed defeated and desperate by that point, despite having an extensive network of connections and support. When he reached Costa Rica, the disgraced politician entered the country under a false identity and disguised himself by growing a beard. During the rest of his time on the run, he bounced all around South America and the Caribbean. Montesinos eventually ended up in Venezuela, where he gained entry under an alias and underwent plastic surgery in Caracas. However, he made one mistake. He failed to pay the bill. The clinic's director, Louise Ponte, told Reuters that he and his staff had no idea their patient was a wanted fugitive, let alone a high-profile one. Ponte said that Montesinos had his nose and eyelids reshaped. Venezuelan officials denied allowing anyone into the country under Montesinos' alleged alias, causing some people to accuse the country of helping him hide. Authorities adamantly denied the allegation and noted that while many Venezuelans were intrigued by the story of Montesinos' flight from justice, he wasn't the type of person anyone wanted in the country. With help from the US government, formerly one of Montesinos' biggest supporters, authorities apprehended the ex-official in 2001. He was deported to Peru, where he faced trial for multiple charges. In the end, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison and still faces several more trials for his alleged crimes. Number 13. Juan Carlos Ramirez Abadia. Nicknamed Chupeta or Lollipop, Juan Carlos Ramirez Abadia was the self-proclaimed leader of Colombia's biggest drug syndicate, the North Valley Cartel. He had an 18-year partnership with Joaquin Guzman, the prolific drug kingpin better known as El Chapo, that began during the 1990s after the two met in a hotel room in Mexico City. During that period, Ramirez supplied El Chapo with plane loads of his finest product. While testifying at El Chapo's trial in 2018, he said he amassed a $1.8 billion fortune. Over a 20-year period, he helped smuggle an estimated 400,000 kilos of cocaine into the United States and ordered hits on as many as 150 people. U.S. law enforcement began searching for Ramirez in 2004 after indicting him on federal racketeering charges. By then, he was also wanted on drug trafficking charges in America dating back to 1994. Colombian authorities denied an extradition request and a $5 million bounty was offered for his arrest. 2 years later, in 2006, the American government began seizing Ramirez's assets, but their efforts to track down the drug lord himself proved futile. Ramirez was finally captured during a drug raid in Brazil in 2007. While awaiting extradition to the US, he began cooperating with authorities who noticed that he looked a lot different from his mugshots. He admitted that he had undergone extensive plastic surgery in a bid to evade law enforcement and was recovering from his latest operation when he was arrested. When Ramirez took the stand during El Chapo's trial in 2018, he went into detail about the evolution of his face, stating that he went under the knife 3 or 4 times. He altered his jawbone, cheekbone, eyes, mouth, ears, and nose. The changes came following a years-long effort to erase his name, image, and fingerprints from public records. In addition to getting plastic surgery, Ramirez wore an array of disguises that included wigs and glasses. He hardly ever left his mansion for any reason other than to get plastic surgery, but when he did go somewhere, he was in costume. Sadly for Ramirez, he looked a lot better before all the work he had done to his face. The procedures left him with oversized cheekbones, an extremely wide jawline, a noticeably narrow nose, and other unnatural features. In 2010, he took a plea deal and agreed to become a government witness in exchange for a 25-year sentence. The information he's provided has helped lead to the capture and conviction of several high-profile drug traffickers, including his former partner El Chapo.
Federal authorities also credit Ramirez with providing valuable intelligence on corrupt government officials, Colombian paramilitary groups, and cartel members who've murdered government informants and witnesses. Number 12. Andrew Moran. In 2005, Andrew Moran and several co-conspirators committed a violent armed robbery in Lancashire, England. When the case went to trial 4 years later, Moran leapt over the dock and fought off 4 guards before fleeing on foot. He remained at large for the next 4 years as he moved through Europe using various false identities and disguises. Moran grew his hair out, sported a mustache, had a mole removed from his chin, and even underwent plastic surgery in a bid to make himself difficult to recognize. Spanish and British authorities tracked him to a villa in Alicante, Spain in 2012, and came up with a strategic plan to take him into custody. Police set up a roadblock in anticipation of the arrest, but Moran managed to bypass it and continued by leading law enforcement on a high-speed chase at speeds of up to 130 miles per hour. Authorities attempted another arrest 6 months later, in 2013. This time they caught him completely off guard as he sunbathed outside his villa with some friends. Moran attempted to flee by climbing over a wall, but he didn't get away. During a search of the property, police found guns, knives, drugs, fake passports, and documents containing at least 5 different identities and a large amount of cash. Photos in Moran's cell phone revealed that he lived a life of leisure and luxury while on the run. And he routinely received money from his girlfriend to help support his unreasonable tastes, which included a penchant for expensive cars and upscale vacations. During Moran's trial in Britain in 2016, the same judge who was presiding over the hearing he fled from 7 years earlier imposed an indeterminate prison sentence. Judge Norman Wright classified the sentence as necessary for public safety and noted the risks associated with freeing Moran, including ample access to resources which could enable him to stay on the run for long periods of time. While handing down the sentence, Wright said that Moran may never be released from prison, but he'll be eligible for his first parole hearing in 2014. Number 11. Caitlyn Armstrong. During a trip to Austin, Texas for a professional cycling race in 2022, 25-year-old Mariah Wilson made time to meet up with her ex-boyfriend, cyclist Colin Strickland. Just minutes after returning to the house where she was staying, she was gunned down in cold blood. It didn't take long for investigators to discover that Strickland's girlfriend at the time, 34-year-old yoga instructor Caitlyn Armstrong, was allegedly insanely jealous of Wilson. Surveillance footage from outside the house where Wilson was staying showed an SUV resembling Armstrong's pulling up to the address right after Wilson returned. The more detectives uncovered, the more they began to suspect Armstrong of murdering the victim in a fit of rage. Strickland cooperated with law enforcement and was eventually ruled out as a suspect, further narrowing detectives' sights on Armstrong. Her family issued a statement insisting she wasn't capable of committing such a horrific crime, but the fact that she went on the run did little to support her claim of innocence. After obtaining a warrant for Armstrong's arrest, investigators discovered that she'd sold her Jeep and flown to New York 3 days after the murder. Her trail went cold from there, sparking an international manhunt. U.S. Marshals tracked her down at a hostel in Costa Rica 43 days later. She fell under the suspicion of local authorities when she gave them her ID at a checkpoint, and they had no record of someone entering the country under her name. It was later discovered that Armstrong had flown to Costa Rica from Newark, New Jersey, with her sister's passport. The fleeing fugitive looked much different when she was picked up by law enforcement. She'd cut her normally reddish hair short and dyed it a dark shade of brown. A witness told Inside Edition that Armstrong left behind a receipt under the name Allison Page for a $6,350 plastic surgery procedure. During her time on the run, she had a bandage on her nose and bruising beneath her eyes, which she allegedly blamed on a surfing accident. However, a before and after comparison of her face shows dramatic differences in her appearance, including a slimmer nose and a narrower chin. Armstrong pleaded not guilty to murder and is slated to go to trial on October 30th, 2023. Number 10. Richard Ramos. Dr. Jose Castillo was a highly respected plastic surgeon based in Philadelphia who was praised among locals and members of the Hispanic community for generously providing free basic medical care to those who couldn't afford it. People were understandably shocked when Castillo was arrested in 1996 for knowingly performing cosmetic surgery on fugitive drug dealer Richard Ramos, who was wanted for selling more than $20 million worth of crack and cocaine on the streets of Philly. The drug ring that Ramos led was busted in 1990, but he managed to slip away to the Poconos, where he remained in hiding for nearly 2 years. He occasionally snuck back into Philadelphia for late-night plastic surgery appointments with Dr. Castillo, though, who reshaped Ramos's nose, sucked massive amounts of fat from his face and body, and smoothed over the man's bullet wound scars on his right cheek, so they were practically unnoticeable. The most shocking procedure involved cutting off Ramos's fingerprints and reattaching them upside down. Authorities finally captured Ramos in early 1992 while he was in the street changing his wife's flat tire. He was practically unrecognizable from the man people knew him as before all the plastic surgery, but admitted to his identity during questioning and was arrested. In the meantime, Dr. Castillo was federally charged with harboring a fugitive and obstructing justice. The respected surgeon claimed that he only treated Ramos once for grease burns, but that was quickly disproven. He then argued that he performed the procedures before Ramos was a wanted fugitive, which was also proven to be a lie. The community nevertheless rallied around him in support of his innocence and freedom. Ramos, who was originally facing life in prison, took a plea deal and agreed to testify against Castillo in exchange for a reduced 30-year sentence. A jury found Castillo guilty, and the judge sentenced him to a year of house arrest followed by 2 years of probation, along with 400 hours of community service and a $35,000 fine. Number 9. Ronnie Biggs. One of British history's most notorious fugitives, Ronnie Biggs, began his life of crime in 1963 when he and 14 others held up a mail train. He was 34 years old at the time and wanted money for a down payment on a house. Police tracked Biggs down and arrested him in London 3 weeks later after an accomplice failed to destroy evidence containing his fingerprints. And as a result, 9 of the conspirators, including Biggs, received 30-year prison sentences. In 1965, 15 months into his sentence, Biggs escaped from prison and fled to Brussels. From there, he met up with his wife, Charmaine, and his 2 children in Paris, where he obtained fake identity papers and underwent extensive plastic surgery to alter his appearance. The family then moved to Australia in 1966, and by that point, the money from the train robbery was almost gone. A large portion of it went to cosmetic procedures, costing the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Biggs bounced around Australia over the next few years, moving from one place to the next whenever someone warned him that authorities were on his trail. In 1969, he left the country on a cruise ship using a fake passport and spent a brief time in Panama before traveling to Brazil. Charmaine stayed in Australia with the kids and divorced Biggs in 1974 after discovering that he'd fathered a child with another woman. Authorities allowed her to stay in the country, and she made money to get on her feet by selling her story to the press. She went on to become a respected editor and journalist. Meanwhile, Biggs enjoyed a leisurely life in Rio de Janeiro, where he was safe from deportation due to the lack of an extradition agreement between Britain and Brazil. As a wanted criminal, he wasn't allowed to work, but he no longer had to hide his identity. So he supported himself by hosting parties and telling tourists about his life as a criminal on the run. By the time Britain and Brazil finally established an extradition treaty in 1997, Biggs had been granted lifelong residency in Brazil. He returned to the UK of his own volition in 2001 and was immediately imprisoned to serve out the remaining 28 years of his sentence for the train robbery. His health was deteriorating rapidly, and he petitioned for compassionate release multiple times before finally being freed in 2009. But Biggs died in 2013, just hours before a BBC special about the train robbery premiered. Number 8. Luis Carlos de Rocha. For nearly 30 years, notorious cocaine kingpin Luis Carlos de Rocha lived in the shadows while amassing a $100 million fortune from the illicit drug trade. Nicknamed the White Head, he operated cocaine production facilities in the wilderness of Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. From there, the drugs were flown to remote farms in western Brazil and Paraguay, where they were packed and hidden into trucks for domestic distribution and prepared for international shipments. De Rocha's operation distributed an estimated 5 tons of cocaine throughout Brazil alone each month, and his product was shipped as far away as Europe and the United States. To evade authorities, de Rocha went by false identities and altered his appearance through plastic surgery. He managed to go undetected for 3 decades, but he apparently didn't make dramatic enough changes to his face to hide forever. Law enforcement eventually managed to track him down by matching known photos of him to pictures that were taken under his assumed identity, Vitor Luis de Moraes. In addition to changing his appearance, de Rocha was protected by heavily armed guards. He has a reputation for resorting to extreme violence, so apprehending him would require a lot more planning and manpower than simply taking a SWAT team to his door and kicking it in. De Rocha was arrested in 2017 as part of a police mission codenamed Operation Spectrum, which aimed to prevent drug trafficking. Around 150 agents stormed 24 of his properties, where they seized an estimated $10 million worth of assets, including luxury cars, homes, and aircraft. They also found guns, suitcases filled with cash, and false identification documents. The kingpin himself was captured in the city of Sorriso, and in the end he was sentenced to more than 50 years in prison. Number 7. Tatsuya Ichihashi. 22-year-old British national Lindsay Hawker was smothered to death in 2007 during a year-long stay in Japan, where she took a job teaching English. Investigators traced her last known whereabouts to the apartment of one of her students, 28-year-old Tatsuya Ichihashi. 9 officers gathered outside the apartment in Chiba Prefecture, but Ichihashi managed to slip out of their grasp not once but twice after fleeing on foot. They found Hawker's brutally beaten and strangled body in a bathtub on the suspect's balcony. She'd been covered in compost and a substance used for speeding up decomposition. Ichihashi remained on the run for 2.5 years, despite thousands of reported sightings. Finally, in November 2009, he was apprehended in Osaka while trying to board a ferry to Okinawa. He initially denied any involvement in Hawker's murder, then tried to claim that he accidentally killed her while trying to stifle her screams. He also apparently told officers that he tried to resuscitate her. While in jail awaiting trial, Ichihashi wrote a book called Until the Arrest. In it, he wrote that he performed plastic surgery on himself in an effort to change his appearance. He didn't go into detail about Hawker's murder and instead focused on his time on the run. The fugitive's first operation on himself was a DIY nose job. Using a needle and thread, he bound his nose to make it narrower. After that, he tried to cut off part of his lower lip, which he completed on a second try after stopping the first time due to the excruciating pain. Next, he cut 2 moles off his face after noticing how prominent they were in a wanted poster featuring his photo. He further obscured his appearance by wearing a surgical mask, which wasn't an uncommon practice in Japan even during the pre-COVID era. He avoided eye contact and surveillance cameras as much as possible, moved frequently, and had 0 contact with his family and friends. Ichihashi also ended up using his savings to get a professional nose job. Afterward, the clinic alerted police and provided them with photos. The wanted murderer knew that he couldn't stay on the run forever though, and when he was finally caught, he surrendered without resistance. Hawker's family campaigned for the death penalty, but Ichihashi was sentenced to life in prison after a court concluded that there's a hope of rehabilitating him. Number 6. Amado Carrillo Fuentes. Mexican drug lord Amado Carrillo Fuentes worked with multiple crime syndicate bosses including Pablo Escobar and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. He eventually assassinated his boss and seized control of the Juarez cartel. Carrillo famously transported his drugs via a large fleet of chartered jets that were financed with laundered money earning him the nickname El Señor de los Cielos, or Lord of the Skies. Throughout his lifetime, he amassed a $25 billion fortune, which would be worth around $40 billion in today's currency. Despite his immense power in the drug world, Carrillo didn't become a household name like other cartel leaders. To a large degree, he was a man of mystery who led a quiet and private life. Washington Post writer John Ward Anderson described him as a new breed, classified by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration as a low-profile kingpin who behaved like a businessman. But Carrillo's lack of a public presence didn't make him immune to legal scrutiny. During the 1990s, U.S. and Mexican authorities turned up the heat on their search for Carrillo amid civilian protests in the state of Morelos, where residents accused the governor of turning a blind eye to drug activity. There weren't many photos of Carrillo circulating, owing to his discreet lifestyle, but law enforcement was nevertheless hot on his trail. After narrowly avoiding capture in 1997, he decided to make some extreme changes to his appearance. Going by the alias Antonio Flores Montes, he checked into a plastic surgery clinic in Mexico City, where he underwent a major facial reconstruction surgery and liposuction. The procedure seemed to go fine, but something went terribly wrong while Carrillo was recovering. Not long after, the man passed away at just 40 years old. Rumors that his death was faked immediately began to spread like wildfire. American officials announced that he suffered a fatal heart attack and released a photo of his body to dispel the claims, but even Carrillo's cousin said that the person in the casket was a look-alike and that Carrillo was fine. Authorities stood by their stance that the drug kingpin was dead and maintained their belief that Carrillo hadn't slipped through their hands. But several months later, the bodies of the two surgeons who performed Carrillo's surgery were found encased in concrete, and they showed signs of torture. Number 5. Hugo Armando Carvajal. Also known as El Polo or the Chicken, Hugo Armando Carvajal served as the head of Venezuela's military intelligence from 2004 to 2011. He also served as the country's top official against organized crime and the financing of terrorism. And in 2013, he became the head of military counterintelligence. By then, U.S. officials had filed drug trafficking charges against Carvajal. They suspected him of supporting the trafficking activities of the Colombian guerrilla group FARC, which he denies. But regardless, they were eager to get him into custody as soon as possible. However, he remained a free man until 2019, when he was apprehended in Spain. Spanish authorities initially denied a request for extradition to the US, and Carvajal was released from custody. The decision was challenged and overturned, but by then he'd gone on the run and was nowhere to be found. In 2020, the American government filed narco-terrorism charges against Carvajal and several other Venezuelan officials, including President Nicolás Maduro, for their alleged involvement in the international drug trade. Carvajal was recaptured in Madrid in 2021 after evading law enforcement for 2 years. Shortly after his arrest, officials revealed that he'd avoided getting caught by using disguises and getting plastic surgery. In a statement, Spain's national police said that there was evidence of Carvajal undergoing several cosmetic procedures. They also found wigs, fake mustaches and beards, along with other accessories that were used to alter his appearance. He moved every 3 months and never left his house. His outdoor activity was limited to stepping out on his balcony at night, always in disguise. His extradition was approved, but Carvajal stopped it from happening by appealing to the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled to suspend the extradition. He continues to maintain his innocence, despite being accused of fighting his extradition as a stalling tactic. Number 4. Sarahat Sawangjiang. Dealing drugs in Thailand is a risky business. The punishments are incredibly harsh and can include the death penalty, so it's not entirely surprising that 25-year-old kingpin Sarahat Sawangjiang was barely recognizable when authorities stormed his apartment in early 2023. The young criminal had been arrested multiple times before, and he became wanted again in late 2022 after police intercepted a package containing a large quantity of MDMA that was heading to his address in Bangkok's Bang Na district. When law enforcement caught up with Sarahat 3 months later, they had to do a double take to make sure it was really him. His previously blemished skin had cleared up, taking years off his appearance. And after coming face to face with the drug dealer, officers finally understood why witnesses described him as an attractive South Korean man, which sounded nothing like the suspect they dealt with in the past. To achieve his youthful new look, Sarahat underwent a cosmetic procedure known as a face-off. He allegedly confessed to dealing drugs that he ordered on the dark web and paid for with cryptocurrency, and said that he planned to start a new life in South Korea under the name Jimin Seong, despite not knowing the language. That won't be happening anytime soon, however, because he's now in custody and facing a charge for importing narcotics. Number 3. Lennon Oliveira do Carmo. After being arrested in 2018, Brazilian drug dealer and gang leader Lennon Oliveira do Carmo, nicknamed Beleno, was granted release under the condition that he'd wear an ankle bracelet. He returned home to the state of Amazonas to serve his house arrest, but removed the monitoring device and went on the run. By then, Beleno had a long list of priors under his belt. Just a few years earlier, he participated in a violent prison gang riot. On the outside, he commanded an armed militia and ran a leisure club and meeting spot for drug dealers, which he created by diverting the flow of an entire river to create a bathing area. He eventually established a reputation for decapitating his rivals. After Beleno's escape from supervision in 2018, authorities warned the public that he was armed and dangerous and to be on the lookout for him, but they couldn't seem to find him anywhere. Police finally caught up with the fugitive 2 years later in 2020 when they found him living under the alias Elon Soares Cardosa in the city of Caucaia. He looked nothing like the man they were looking for, and his appearance came as a shock to authorities. Beleno doesn't even resemble the same person in his mugshots from before he fled from the law and the one that was taken after his capture. In addition to clearly losing weight during his 2-year absence, officials said he underwent at least 5 plastic surgeries to make himself look different. Beleno was killed in a shootout with military police in 2022 during a response to an anonymous complaint about armed men on a soccer field. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital and attempted to save him, but he succumbed to his injuries. Number 2. Tyler Adams. The man the FBI came to know and describe as a master of disguise, Tyler Adams was given the name Kevin Schoolcraft at birth. Over his lifetime, he's legally changed his name multiple times and has used over a dozen aliases. He also has an alleged plastic surgery obsession, which would explain his highly unnatural appearance in photos that were released to the public in 2022 after his girlfriend was found murdered in Mexico. Adams' first major criminal case came in 2009 when he was accused of fraudulently buying more than $3 million worth of real estate in California, taking out loans and credit cards in his parents' names. He pleaded guilty to 40 felonies and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. And in 2016, he was transferred to Hawaii to serve time for a previous fraud conviction. He escaped custody in 2019 and fled to San Diego, where he met and began dating 40-year-old Navy veteran Raquel Sabin, who knew Adams as Paul Phillips. The couple had a daughter in 2021, and 6 months later, they traveled to Mexico in Raquel's mother's vehicle. About a month after that, Raquel's heavily decomposed remains were found in the car. Her neck was broken, and her death was ruled a homicide. The baby was found safe elsewhere, and Adams was taken into custody for questioning in connection with Raquel's murder. He was uncooperative, though, and Mexican authorities turned him over to border agents at the San Isidro crossing after discovering that he was wanted for escaping custody in Hawaii. Somehow he managed to cross the border under the name Aaron Bain. Adams has been on the run ever since and remains wanted for a growing list of reasons, including law enforcement's desire to question him in connection with Raquel's murder. When authorities released photos of him to the public in hopes of receiving leads regarding his whereabouts, people were genuinely freaked out by his appearance. Images of Adams' transformation over the years show a disturbing shift from a natural-looking face to appearing more like a wax figurine. It's more than a little obvious that he overdid it with plastic surgery, and his vast array of hair colors and style shows that he truly does have the ability to make himself look like an entirely different person. Adams' stepfather, Donald Chaffee, told CBS 8 that the fugitive first had plastic surgery as a teenager. While in custody in San Diego in 2012, Adams filed a written complaint claiming that 2 fellow inmates beat him up and dislodged his cheek and chin implants. He then requested immediate medical attention. When asked how he felt about Raquel's murder, Chavi said his stepson has always been a sociopath, but he never imagined Adams' behavior escalating to such gruesome violence. Hawaiian officials described Adams as a con man and a sociopath with no regard for his victims. Thinking about it in those terms, it's pretty scary to realize that he's still at large. Number 1. John Ruffo. In 1998, former business executive John Ruffo was convicted of swindling US and foreign banks out of more than $350 million, making him one of the biggest banking fraudsters in American history. He was sentenced to 17 years in prison, but failed to turn himself into federal custody to begin serving his time. Ruffo was last seen withdrawing money from an ATM in Queens, New York, on the afternoon of his planned surrender. He hasn't been seen or heard from ever since, leaving authorities and even his own family clueless to his whereabouts. Shortly after his disappearance, his rented Ford Taurus was found abandoned in the parking lot at JFK International Airport. Multiple alleged sightings of Ruffo have been reported over the years, but the only credible lead came in 2001 when he tried wiring himself $250 million from Nigeria at several banks in Duncan, Oklahoma. But by the time the feds closed in on the area, he was gone. In 2022, former fraudster Seth Ferranti, who also spent time on America's Most Wanted Fugitives list, told the UK Sun that Ruffo might be living a totally normal, inconspicuous lifestyle under an assumed identity. He further speculated that the wanted white-collar criminal may have had plastic surgery to disguise his appearance or even to remove his fingerprints. After all, it would be reasonable to assume that he made some dramatic changes to his looks, or that he likely would have been caught by now. Ruffo is considered extremely intelligent and may be one of the few fleeing felons who actually is smarter than most of the people who are looking for him. He was a man with a plan, and he had international connections and access to resources that would undoubtedly enable someone to remain on the run for a long time. More than 24 years after Ruffo vanished, authorities still hope to catch the 68-year-old. In 2022, he was featured in the Hulu documentary Have You Seen This Man?, in hopes that the show would help lead to his capture. But for now, and possibly forever, he remains at large.
Thanks for watching. Which would you regret more? Taking your desire for revenge against someone way too far and doing something extremely mean that you know the person didn't deserve? Or taking the high road and choosing not to seek revenge when you had the chance, but feeling as though the person got away with wronging you when they truly deserve to get a taste of their own medicine? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.